Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the election of 1800. Let me go ahead and make this bigger for a second so we can see. So, in our last chapter, we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Kind of wrapping up John Adams' term as president. And with the Alien and Sedition Acts, as we know, had a lot of backlash from the rest of the country. A lot of people feeling that it restricted their rights, which it did with their freedom of speech and freedom of press. And so John Adams' popularity really greatly decreased during that time. And when it came to time for re-election here in the election of 1800, John Adams is running for re-election once again, but there are a number of other candidates that are also going to be running for president, including Thomas Jefferson. And so this election, just like we saw with the first one in 1796, which was significant because for the first time we had multiple candidates for president and we also had the emergence of political parties. The election of 1800 is also going to be influential and monumental in what the legacy that it leaves behind, that being the 12th Amendment. So John Adams here as the incumbent, right? He's the incumbent candidate because he's the one running for re-election. He's the one who's presently in office. He comes in representing the Federalist Party as usual. Part of his campaigning is the fact that he accuses Thomas Jefferson of being too pro-French, right, and too much of an ally of the French. Also because Thomas Jefferson was a big advocate for science and a big advocate for philosophy. They kind of used that against him to saying that because of that, he was going to destroy organized religion. And so that was one of the campaign tactics that the Federalist Party used against Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, then accused Adams of trying to become a monarch, right? Trying to become a king because of the Alien and Sedition Acts that were restricting American freedoms. And eventually John Adams was just going to take too much power in the government. So these were our two main candidates here, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, just because of their influence and who they were at the time. Now, along with Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party also had someone else running, which was Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was well known for his military service during the Revolution. He also served as Attorney General in New York. And for Aaron Burr, it's going to be difficult because when the election becomes a tie, a lot of the Democratic Republicans thought that Aaron Burr should have dropped out of the race and then given the presidency to Thomas Jefferson instead of the long drawn out election process that they had to go through. So after the election, even though he does become vice president, he is not really well accepted by the Democratic Republicans. You know, he's not a Federalist, so he's kind of on the outskirts. And for Aaron Burr, eventually kind of ruins his reputation. And he blames a lot of that on Alexander Hamilton, which is why in the end, in a few years, Aaron Burr is actually going to challenge Alexander Hamilton to a duel, right? And it's going to end up killing Alexander Hamilton. It's going to shoot him, and 30 hours later, Alexander Hamilton's going to die from his wounds. So that's what ends that rivalry there. Alexander Hamilton then is not really running in this election. So he's here because he's influential, but not because he's one of the presidential candidates, right? So make sure we understand that Alexander Hamilton was not running for president. His part in this was that when the election came about, right, and there ended up being a tie for first place between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they each received 73 electoral votes. It went to the House of Representatives to break this tie, which also took a number of tries. But it's going to be Hamilton who eventually convinces members of the House to vote for Thomas Jefferson instead of Aaron Burr. And so that's really going to spark that rivalry and kind of hatred between these two that eventually will lead to that duel. John Adams then only gets 64% of the votes, or 64 electoral votes, not percent. So he then, of course, does not advance to becoming anything in the next presidency. So that's why he only served for one term. Another Federalist that was running at that time for president was Charles Pinckney. And remember, Pinckney was the one responsible for Pinckney's Treaty with Spain, which allowed us to reopen and reuse New Orleans as a port. But we will see Pinckney once again and in the next election in 1804. And then John Jay wasn't really running at all. He ended up receiving one electoral vote out of nowhere. That's why he's here. Remember, John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the United States. He also did that whole Jay's Treaty with Britain, which a lot of people didn't like because it still didn't punish British too much for what they were doing to us, and it ended up making us pay more money to the British. But he did get one electoral vote, even though he was not officially running for president. So in the election of 1800, what happens is, for the first time in history, we have this tie, right? And the way that the Electoral College worked at this time was that this electoral delegates from each of the states, right, they each had 2 votes. But those votes were not specific as to who they voted for president and who they voted for vice president. It was just 2 general votes. So they just put 2 names down. And then when they tallied up the votes, whoever had the most became president and the runner-up became vice president. That was the way that it had worked. But now, when for the first time we tally up the votes, we have 73 votes for each Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. We're not really sure how this is going to pan out. So for the first time, it goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House, it also becomes deadlocked as they keep tying for multiple times until Hamilton finally does his magic. And Thomas Jefferson finally wins the majority of the House and becomes president. Aaron Burr becomes his vice president. However, that also spurs the passing of the 12th Amendment, which then, for the first time, created a separate ballot for the president and the vice president. So now when the Electoral College voted, they had to vote specifically for who they were voting for president and who they were voting for vice president. Now, one thing to remember from this over history is that the president and vice president, though usually that we have seen now historically happen, that they're from the same party, does not necessarily mean that they have to be, right? The 12th Amendment does not restrict different parties from being voted as president and vice president. So even though that has been the norm, just because it's much easier to work with someone who shares your viewpoints, it's not something that is required. So it could technically happen that you would have a president and a vice president from differing parties running together. But we have yet to see that happen in history, so we shall see if that ever comes along anytime in the future. So that primarily is what happened here in the election of 1800. Significance of these things here in the election, primarily it's the first time that we have a tie that leads to the House to have to break that tie, and that's what led to the passing of the 12th Amendment. And it's also the first time in history that we have a peaceful transition from one type of government to another, meaning that it's the first time that we see a peaceful transition from a Federalist-led government by John Adams to now a Democratic Republican-led government by Thomas Jefferson, right? And it was a peaceful transfer of power between these two. And it's something that we sometimes take for granted of how a peaceful transition happens in our country. It's something that doesn't happen all the time. There's a lot of times where you have all of these violent takeovers and all these coups d'etats that happen in other countries whenever it comes time to election. And here in the United States, ever since our first time that we transitioned from one party to the other, it has been a peaceful transition. And it's something that is unique to the way that our country has structured its foundations for government.